from here, MCC, from the Center for Constitutional Politics, and it is my pleasure to act as one of the hosts of today's conference, Natural Law for Real Life. It is always such a great pleasure to welcome such a vast array of intellectuals from all over the world, and on behalf of MCC, we are very much grateful for your attendance. But now, I would like to give the floor to Professor Kálmán Póca, who is the head of the Center for Constitutional Politics, in order to say a couple of opening words for your presence here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and distinguished speakers, my name is Kálmán Póca. I'm the head of the Center for Constitutional Politics here at the MCC. It is an honor and a privilege to welcome you all to the Natural Law for Real Life Problems conference, hosted by the Mathias Corvinus Collegium and the University of Public Service. As the head of the Center for Constitutional Politics, I'm delighted to be part of Hungary's largest private educational institution, which offers high-level training in several disciplines with programs extending beyond the traditional school system. For the academic years 2024-25, MCC has enrolled over 7,000 students, comprising approximately 2,000 primary school students, 4,000 high school students, and around 1,000 undergraduate students. We have established 23 regional centers in the Carpathian Basin, including 14 in Hungary and 9 in neighboring countries. Our center, the Center for Constitutional Politics, is committed to fostering a deeper understanding of constitutional principles and their application in shaping our society. If men were angels, no government would be necessary, James Madison famously said. However, that's not what we are dealing with in reality. Political power and authority is exercised by fallible people over fallible people, with no angels at either end. Our research at the Center for Constitutional Politics examines how this political authority is created and at the same time constrained by constitutions adopted by imperfect people. Through rigorous research and dynamic engagement, we strive to connect theoretical insights with real-world challenges, much like this conference aimed to achieve. Today, we have the distinct pleasure of hosting one of the world's foremost scholars in the field, Professor John Finnis. His pioneering contributions to the understanding of natural law have been instrumental in shaping contemporary legal thought. Professor Finnis' work has provided a robust foundation for discussions that assess the relevance of classical theories in addressing modern-day challenges. We are deeply grateful for his presence and eagerly anticipate the insights he will share with us. This conference marks a significant opportunity to delve into the principles of natural law and critically assess their application in resolving pressing social and legal problems. Through the sessions, I'm quite sure, we will engage with thought-provoking presentations and discussions that promise to deepen our understanding and inspire innovative approaches in our respective fields. In closing, let us embark on this intellectual journey with open minds and a collective determination to draw actionable insights from the timeless principles of natural law. May this conference inspire innovative solutions and foster enduring collaborations that extend beyond these walls. Thank you all for being here. I wish you a productive and inspiring day.
And now we are starting off with our very first panel with the name The Conceptual Questions in Natural Law Jurisprudence. Within this panel, we are going to firstly listen to Professor Sean Coyle from the University of Birmingham, where he is the director of the Forum for the Study of Natural Law. And afterwards, we are going to listen to Laura Biron Scott from St. Augustine's College, where she is a research fellow. And lastly, we are going to listen to Professor Maris Köpcke from the University of Oxford, but she will join us online. Maris Köpcke is a research associate of the Program for the Foundation of Law and Constitutional Government at the University of Oxford. And as a moderator, we are going to have Professor Christopher Tollefson, who is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. So firstly, I would like to kindly ask Professor Sean Coyle to hold his speech, then the other speakers, and afterwards we are going to have the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Köszönöm, thank you very much for your amazing hospitality here. It's very much appreciated, and thank you for hosting us in your beautiful city. So these are some more or less random thoughts that have been rattling around my head, and they're kind of first essays into the topic. So the title of the talk that I gave was referred to Analytical Thomism, which is a term of art, but I want to use it in a more extended sense this morning to cover that theory which its detractors have called the new natural law theory, which is Thomistic in its inspiration and analytical in its methods, and so I feel justified in using that term to cover that theory. And what I want to do is to offer some friendly questions, maybe even playful questions to that theory, though not without a serious point. And I want to do that by formulating those questions in the form of observations which invite a response. Now, as we all know, the theory is premised upon the enumeration of basic human goods. And in Positivism's version of the theory, there are 7 such goods. And although the exact composition of those goods has changed over time, the number has always remained the same, 7. Now, I think that the basis of that theory is certainly one of the key texts in the canon of Western political thought, and I think will always remain so. But there are, I guess, I mean, I don't feel vastly motivated to come up with a finite list of basic human goods, but if I were, there are some that I think I would like to add. And I'll give you 2 examples. The first example is being of use to others. Now that might strike you as a rather strange candidate for a basic human good, but the way that I like to think about it is in terms of Dickens's A Christmas Carol, where towards the end of that novella, Scrooge is taken by the ghost of Christmas future to see his freshly dug grave. And all the characters are saying what a terrible man, what an execrable man he was. He never did anything for anybody except himself, and we're glad he's dead. And this wounds Scrooge, cuts him to the core. And it wounds him because being of use to others is also good for oneself. Now, does this devolve to the good of skillful performance and labour? I don't think so, for 2 reasons. First of all, the labour in question may be entirely unskilled. And secondly, the point of that good was that it was the performance itself which is the focus of delight, whereas in my case, it's more towards the ends to which that labour is put. So does it reduce to sociability? Well, maybe it does, but the way that sociability is theorized in natural law and natural rights is in terms of relationships. In the most basic case, the relationship between 2 parties to a contract or 2 students in a seminar. But what I have in mind, there need be no direct relationship between the parties at all. They may live in separate political communities at the far ends of the earth, and it may well be that the business or the transaction goes through a series of middlemen. And so it may be that the beneficiaries of the labour never get to learn the identity of their benefactor, and the benefactor never gets to learn the identity of the individuals whom his or her labour has served. And it seems to me to stretch credulity to believe that there is any kind of overarching community between those parties in those circumstances. And so what I have in mind, I think, is closer to charity than sociability. So the second example I want to give you is rest, cessation from pursuing all of the other basic goods. Now, rest is an incredibly important part of life. We can't live without it, which is why sleep deprivation is a torture and why hard labour is such a harsh sentence, because the body doesn't get to rest adequately between bouts of heavy labour. Now, does this mean that this good reduces to that of life and bodily health? Well, as I've said, you can't live without rest, but then neither can you live without knowledge. Knowledge of how to feed oneself, clothe oneself, look after oneself, be provident for oneself. But knowledge doesn't reduce to the good of life, and so neither does rest, because at the end of the day, what we all desire is a good rest. And that is maybe the hallmark of a basic good, that you can pursue it even when you don't need to pursue it. You can enjoy a rest even when you don't really need one. Now, this brings me to what I really wanted to talk about this morning, because if you reach back through the Aristotelian Thomist tradition, you'll find that the central concern is not with the enumeration of basic goods, but rather the identity of the best form of life. And Aristotle, to begin with him, believes that the best form of life is the life of intellectual virtue or contemplation. And he believes this because he believes that the human being is a composite of an intellective soul and a sensitive soul. And the intellective soul is more noble than the sensitive soul. So he was always going to believe that some form of contemplation would be the best form of life. And Aquinas follows him. Of course he does, because he believes that the ultimate end for human beings is the contemplation of the beatific vision. And what's last in fulfillment is first in intention, which would seem to indicate that the basic goods are not basic, they're secondary to the to the question of the best form of life. They're still relevant, of course, because you can't contemplate all the time, but they seem to be secondary to that question in the classical tradition. Now, Aristotle himself admits that contemplation is not a life that is open to everybody. Very few people can live the life of contemplation. And so for the unlucky ones who can't contemplate, he offers an alternative form of life in the shape of the life of practical virtue or moral virtue, centered upon the good of honor. But still, again, few people are capable of living a life of practical virtue. And so for the rest, what he calls the masses, the coarse people, the vulgar people, and other epithets that he uses against them, and whom I'm going to insist to be called ordinary people, they, he says, live a life fit only for cattle. They're not fit to hear lectures on ethics. They live a life centered upon the pursuit of pleasure. Now, sweeping generalizations aside, I think there are 2 points to come out of this. The first point is that Aristotle's theory is an aristocratic theory. It's a theory of the good of the few and not the good of the many. And the second point is that if ordinary people are incapable of absorbing lectures on ethics, where do they go to get their moral bearings? Where do they get their moral message? Well, it used to be the case that they would get that message on a Sunday in church, in the homily and the Psalms and the Gospel readings. but not anymore, because people don't go to church anymore. So what about the family? Well, all well and good if you're born into a good family where the parents transmit good values to their offspring, but not so fortunate if you're born into a bad family or a criminal family where bad values are transmitted to the offspring. And even in a good family, parents sometimes have rather immoral views on topics like racism or the permissibility of telling exculpatory lies or white lies, and so not reliably the family. So what about politics? Well, not politics, because politics is divisive and tribal, and it's riven through with sectional interests, and truth is not a value that's often very much in evidence in a lot of political thought and speech, so not politics. So what about the media? Well, the media are capable of great beauty and truth, but for the most part, that's not what they aspire to. For the most part, it's a diet of salacious gossip or insidious political writing. And again, truth can be quite difficult sometimes to pinpoint when addressing the media. So Fox News would be a good example of that. So not the media. So what about us? Well, the fact is that we are no less aristocratic than Aristotle, because we talk to each other, we don't talk to ordinary people. And so I can wager you that not one word of what is spoken between us today and tomorrow, not one word of it will resonate beyond these walls, not one. And so I want to call for a new form of public preaching. We need to get out of our universities. We need to go into the public square, into the marketplace, into schools and hospitals and prisons, and into the media. And we need to spread our moral message. We need to simplify that message quite radically so that ordinary people can understand it, but without distorting it. And above all, we need to make that message relevant, even exciting to ordinary people. Now, it's all gone quiet in here because you're now expecting me to tell you how we are going to do that. But I'm afraid that's where I run out of road. I don't really know. But what I'm hoping is that some of you may have some ideas about how we could do that, in which case I very much look forward to hearing from you. But for now, let me just conclude by returning to the issue of the aristocratic character of our theorizing, because it seems to me that our theorizing is premised upon a particular kind of figure, and the exact nature of that figure and the way it's described may differ from theory to theory. So we have the ideally autonomous agent, or the spidaios, or the person of practical wisdom, the person of practical reasonableness, and so on. And what all these characters have in common is that they are not ordinary people, and they don't capture the cadences and patterns of the way in which ordinary people think about and formulate and choose and pursue and wish for and long for and hope for human goods. And even more than that, I'm not entirely sure we capture the suppositions upon which that thinking and choosing and pursuing and formulating and hoping for is the case. And that is in part because we don't address the psychological character of not just ordinary people, but all of us. In that, what I'm thinking of is that some people are romantic, some people are emotional, some people are strong-willed, some people are timid, and so forth. And this affects the way that people approach the virtues. Now, Aristotle actually makes a start on explaining the way that these figures or these features happen in ordinary people in the second book of the Nicomachean Ethics, where he distinguishes from the objective mean of virtue and the subjective mean. But that's only a start, and he doesn't really carry it through. So what am I saying? I guess I'm saying that as long as our theories are premised upon the character of the spadios, etc., our theories will largely fail to gain traction in the external world beyond academia, that will remain to some extent irrelevant to the way that ordinary people live their lives. And I dare to say that, because the title of this conference is about the realities by which people choose and pursue human goods. And what I hope to have done is no more than provide a starting point for the theories that will follow. And if I've done that, then I'll be very happy. But for the moment, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. I hope what I have to say today about Iris Murdoch might provide a helpful addition to what Sean has just outlined. So thank you for inviting me to be part of this conference. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for your hospitality, and it's wonderful to be in this great city of culture and the arts, particularly in light of what I'm going to say. And I just think it's quite appropriate to be talking about Iris Murdoch in a kind of cafe space. I think she would really approve of that. So the topic of my paper is both conceptual and practical and applied at the same time. And it's about law and the arts, and it's also about the basic human good. So it connects those two things together. So to what extent is art the concern of law and lawmakers? In contemporary discourse, there is plenty of hand-wringing about the neglect of the arts, at least in the UK, and the allegedly low levels of support and funding that the arts receive might suggest that to lawmakers, the arts are purely tangential. And as new challenges arise, notably AI and intellectual property law, in Britain, visa requirements for musicians, to be very specific, we should take a step back and ask whether lawmakers should attach more importance to the arts than they currently do. And if they should, why? What is it about the value of art that connects to the deeper purposes of law? Well, the natural law tradition is an especially interesting place to start. Professor Finnis includes aesthetic experience among the basic human goods that contribute to human flourishing and which the law can support. In this paper, I consider the extent to which the writings of the philosopher Iris Murdoch can inform and illuminate this insight and their relevance to the natural law tradition as we understand it today. But to begin, I will take a step back and explore some of the classical foundations of Murdoch's theory and the Platonic insight that law has an important role to play in promoting beauty and the arts. I then explore how Murdoch develops this insight in her work, The Sovereignty of Good, focusing on one central theme in her moral philosophy, that of unselfing, clearing our minds of selfish care and envisioning the good. For Murdoch, the arts have a particularly important role to play in supporting this process of unselfing. And so her ideas not only reveal an important connection between art and human flourishing, they also connect to this broader question in the natural law tradition about the value of art and the purpose of law in promoting the human good. Okay, so the first part of the paper is the philosophical foundations of Murdoch's theory in Plato and also Aristotle. So the importance of the arts to the legislator goes right back to the ancient Greeks. Aristotle, whose place in the natural law tradition is often considered foundational, focuses on the role of art in the last book of his Politics, though this move should be looked at in the wider context of his Ethics. At the start of the Nicomachean Ethics, he shows that his topic is the politikos, the legislator, who looks towards the human good as their ultimate target. And from Book 1, Chapter 7 onwards, this is characterized as activity in accordance with virtue, including the panoply of moral virtues and phronesis detailed in the central books of that work. In the final chapter, Book 10, Chapter 9, he turns towards the practical question of how the human good, now that it has been defined, will actually be promoted. His answer is through education, and it is the task of legislative science, currently in its infancy, to design the right process of education. Now, Aristotle is well known for emphasizing the role of habituation in moral education, both here in Book 10, Chapter 9, and in an earlier section of the work, Book 2, Chapters 1 to 4. But this is only a very general answer. So at the end of the NE, he promises a more specific program of study which will guide the would-be legislator in their work, including their work in state-sponsored moral education. This, to all intents and purposes, is what he then pursues in the Politics. However, it's only in the last 2 books of this work that he turns to more detailed proposals about the best state, the one that the Politikos of the Nicomachean Ethics is aiming at. And one of the main themes is education, which really dominates the work. And what is so telling is that much of his discussion of education is concerned with the arts, and especially music. Now, this in itself, leaving aside the details of his proposals, shows the enormous importance the putative founder of the natural law tradition attached to the arts in the context of legislation. He would presumably look at modern states' neglect of the arts with alarm bordering on horror. But Aristotle's theory did not come out of nowhere. Though he's often so critical of his teacher Plato, in the general contours of his practical philosophy, he is deeply indebted to him, not least in the importance he attaches to the arts. Now, it's of course well known that in the Republic, Plato discusses the role of the arts in public life and imposes very stringent controls. Behind this is the same assumption that Aristotle makes, that the arts shape moral character, for better or for worse, and the same topic is at the forefront of Plato's laws, which he would have been working on while Aristotle was already an established young philosopher in the academy. Now, the laws, not for the faint-hearted, but its title suggests it's about legislation, and it does this at so many different levels, involving a highly complex and sometimes baffling discussion between 3 interlocutors. Now, in the first 2 books, Plato raises the fundamental question as to what the purpose of law is, and his answer is simple. It's to promote human happiness by promoting the core ingredient of that happiness, moral virtue. The Athenian who leads the discussion reflects on different approaches to law, especially that of the Spartans. He applauds them for seeing that law is there to promote virtue among its citizens, but he criticizes them for having a very narrow conception of what virtue is. For them, it's just military courage, when in fact it should embrace many other qualities, especially temperance. So taking the premise that law is there to promote virtue, they need to see how it can promote not just military courage, but also temperance, the battle fought within the soul between reason and appetite. Now, part of Plato's answer is that such training requires habituation, but my interest is what happens at the very beginning of Book 2, in a passage where Plato attempts to define moral education as a process of habituation that ensures the harmony between reason and the affective parts of the soul. The Athenian points out that the effects of state-sponsored habituation, remember Aristotle also is keen on that, these effects very easily wear off, so something extra is needed. And the supplement consists in the arts, a gift of Apollo. So most of the rest of Law's Book 2 is devoted to an examination of the kinds of poetry, music, and dancing that the state should encourage and legislate for. This can be read alongside the draconian policies of the Republic. The similarities include the insistence that art and culture cannot be left to private choice, that the good is always to be promoted above pleasure, that the purpose of art is to encourage the appreciation of beauty, through which the soul will attain beauty of character, that is, virtue. But unlike the Republic, which has strikingly little to say about law explicitly, the laws place the promotion of art and culture squarely at the front of the legislative programme. And the discussion of the arts is one of the first specific proposals in this long work of Plato. So much for the history. Let's stand back and consider the underlying logic here. The state is there to promote human goodness and hence happiness. Art has a crucial role in the development of human goodness, and so a primary responsibility for the state and its legislators is the promotion of the appropriate kind of art. Modern societies that treat art as a sideshow, legislatively speaking, and focus instead on the promotion of STEM subjects are perhaps misguided. So all well and good. But if we start thinking more about state interest in the arts, some troubling questions may arise, not least the threat of censorship. But there is also a more fundamental question. Why should the arts be considered so important? Do they really have the role in promoting human goodness that Plato and Aristotle attached to them? One way to approach this question would be a closer look at the arguments of those two philosophers to understand the mechanisms by which they thought the arts shaped human character. But the danger here is that we get sidetracked on a mainly historical set of questions, immersing ourselves in assumptions about human psychology and, in Plato's case, metaphysics, that we in the 21st century may be unlikely to share. So instead, and this is the second part of the paper, I turn to a 20th century figure, Iris Murdoch, deeply influenced by Plato, but wary of borrowing too many of his assumptions. She admired the broader shape of Plato's thought, his approach to metaphysics, morals, and the arts, and put forward her own view of how the arts shape the human soul for the better and lead it towards virtue. And I wish to explore the idea that her account of the link between art and virtue can be used to show why the law, if it is concerned with the promotion of the human good, should take a much closer interest in the promotion of art than it currently does. And so, Iris Murdoch. In recent years, Murdoch's writings have become much better known within philosophical circles. Although she is best known as a novelist, she spent her formative years as a student and then tutor in philosophy at Oxford University. She wrote widely in the field of moral philosophy, often writing for quite broad and very diverse audiences outside of the academy. She has left behind a significant body of work spanning much of her life. Her approach, along with some of her contemporaries like Philippa Foot and Elizabeth Anscombe, stands in contrast to the so-called anti-metaphysical tides of thought sweeping through Oxford during her time through the influence of logical positivism and its analogue in the moral sphere, moral expressivism, or the view that moral judgments are not based on objective facts, but rather on subjective expressions of desire or emotion. Murdoch took inspiration from the writings of Plato in formulating an approach to philosophy and theology that is unapologetically metaphysical in tone, unafraid to explore big concepts such as moral objectivity, transcendent goodness, the human soul, and other big picture concepts that had largely fallen out of favor in the post-positivist academic environment in which she lived and worked. Murdoch's philosophical interests are broad, and I will focus on one central argument of her work, the sovereignty of good. In this work, she argues that art provides a means through which human moral consciousness can be enlarged, helping us to overcome our selfish tendencies and reorientating us towards the good. So just as Plato draws a link between beauty, the arts, and moral virtue, so Murdoch develops this link in her discussion of unselfing. In the background to her discussion is a rather unusual target, and many people who read The Sovereignty of Good do find it to be quite polemical. She is attacking some of her contemporaries. But she targets what she calls modern moral philosophy as a combination of British empiricism and continental existentialism. She brings them together. And the reason she does this is because, in her view, they both contain an inadequate picture of the self. They both neglect the important metaphor of vision in the moral life, focusing instead on action and movement. So the narrow empiricist view, which is committed to a very clear separation between fact and value, reduces moral judgments to the subjective expressions or prescriptions of a moral agent. And the result is a very impoverished picture of human agency. Human actions and moral actions can then only be analysed through their public and observable manifestations. There is no place for the inner life in that view. Now, continental existentialism, although clearly very different, has a similar impoverished picture of the self. For the existentialist view, according to Murdoch, moral agency is this quick flash of a choosing will that's seemingly unconstrained by any external reality beyond the agent, like love or history or sin. And for Murdoch, this really underestimates the potential for the human will to be influenced by a wide range of factors that can overpower us and prevent us from acting towards the good. And here's how she puts it. We have lost the vision of a reality separate from ourselves, and in so doing, we lack the moral resources to resist the enemy of the moral life, what she famously calls the fat, relentless ego. So a central aim of her discussion is to put forward an alternative soul picture for human moral perception and action, one that is better able to both explain and resist this egocentric pull within human moral consciousness. And Murdoch claims that moral philosophy shares with religion the aim of discussing and defeating this common enemy, the mechanical energy of an egocentric kind that prevents human beings from becoming morally good or better. And it is in discussion of this aim that she brings in her famous concept of unselfing. So in the middle essay of Sovereignty on God and Good, Murdoch notes that one of the key questions for moral philosophy is the question, are there any techniques for the purification and reorientation of an energy which is naturally selfish in such a way that when moments of choice arrive, we shall be sure of acting rightly? And this provides the background for one of her most central philosophical claims, the claim that right vision entails right action. In other words, it's only when our vision of the world and other people is suitably enlarged in such a way that we can see clearly that we are truly capable of acting rightly. As she puts it, I can only choose within the world I can see, in the moral sense of see, which implies that clear vision is the result of moral imagination and moral effort. To achieve right vision, to purify and reorientate the selfish energy that often clouds our moral judgment, Murdoch argues that we need to find suitable objects of attention to redirect our moral energy, saying that our ability to act well depends in part on our habitual objects of attention. Now, because the good is a rather abstract concept, both rare and hard to picture, she says, Murdoch focuses on proxy objects of attention that can direct us to the good, so that we can hope to purify and reorientate our moral vision in such a way that we can hope to act rightly. And in the final essay of Sovereignty, she gives this process of purification and reorientation a more specific title, that of unselfing. Within Murdoch's discussion, we can identify at least 3 different objects of attention that provide opportunities for unselfing: nature, art, and God. Now, art is said to connect with moral virtue in a very direct way as the product of a human artist who can explore human morality and the human condition. She highlights literature and painting as particularly clear examples, and I love the example from Dickens that Sean used. Good art, Murdoch notes, shares with nature a perfection of form which invites unpossessive contemplation and resists absorption into the selfish dream life of the unconscious. Now, this term unpossessive is particularly relevant, and it echoes what Murdoch says in her second essay in Sovereignty, where nature and art are both compared for their potential to purify our moral vision away from selfish concern and towards the good. She says that the appreciation of beauty in both art and nature is the checking of selfishness in the interest of seeing the real. The contemplation of art enables contemplators to see the artist's just and compassionate vision, which does not belong to the self-centered rush of ordinary life. Great art, Murdoch argues, teaches us how real things can be looked at without being seized and used, without being appropriated into the greedy organism of the self. Although she finds art to be a particularly central case of unselfing, she also notes that the same quality of consciousness, a sense of detachment in which selfish concerns vanish, is found in our contemplation of nature, and that it is beauty which attracts this particular sort of unselfish attention. The key is that we experience a sense of detachment from the self enabling us to pierce the veil of selfish consciousness, in her words, and join the world as it really is. So in conclusion, Murdoch develops a Platonic insight about the relationship between art, beauty, and moral virtue, while leaving open the question of exactly how this connects to the project of legislation and policy, which was a real concern of Plato and Aristotle. By studying Murdoch's writings, natural lawyers can gain a fresh perspective on this ancient and sometimes contested question of the extent to which law and lawmakers should be concerned with the arts. This insight might be developed in several directions, and in closing I will mention two, one practical and one theoretical. The practical insight is that policymakers should prioritize the arts and design laws and policies that create opportunities for citizens to experience both artistic and natural beauty. As I've already argued, this would involve a change of direction, at least in the UK, away from the view that the arts are an optional extra to a flourishing human life, and towards an approach that allows all citizens, especially the young, to experience opportunities for unselfing through the arts. And the theoretical insight is that Murdoch's ideas can be drawn upon to illuminate some of the basic human goods that are central to the natural law tradition, and which Sean referred to in his talk. Most obviously, both aesthetic experience and play are important components of art, both its enjoyment and its creation or performance. Given Murdoch's emphasis on the relationship between art, unselfing, and human flourishing, this seems a clear and important direction for further research. And finally, given that Murdoch includes the contemplation of God to be another opportunity for unselfing, and chooses to replace God with a more abstract Platonic notion of good, there could be much to gain by applying her ideas to the seventh and perhaps most neglected basic good, that of religion. But that would require a separate paper, and my time is up. Thank you.
You can share also your presentation.
I shall do so. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me here. And if remotely, I would have loved to join you all in person, but I am unable to travel right now. I appreciate that remote talks are not audience friendly. They are not speaker friendly either. But I have nevertheless chosen to do it. As it was better than not being part of this lovely event at all. So to make up for remoteness, I have prepared a slideshow, which I understand has also been distributed in print in case the distance from the screen is uncomfortable. So I shall now use that slideshow, see if that helps. So the topic of my talk, it's more lawyerly than that of my preceding colleagues. This jurisprudence's lost powers. In a nutshell, what I'll be talking about is this. I'll be discussing a concern with some recent lines of scholarship in what we call general jurisprudence. And these lines of scholarship involve, I shall argue, a distortion of lawmaking as a form of human conduct. And my concern is that this distortion is both wrong descriptively, as a matter of law, and moreover it is dangerous, as it leads to the systematic neglect of a pressing range of questions for jurisprudence. And these questions speak generally to the allocation of legal powers between institutions and also individuals in the framework of law. Now, the problem is not new, but I find that it has recently aggravated, worsened. And this is why here in this very short address, I focus on the latest iteration of the problem, spurred by Mark Greenberg's moral impact theory of law that some of you, I expect, will be familiar with. Right. So in short, my talk will be structured in these four sections. I will first speak about lawmaking in that theory, in the moral impact theory. Secondly, I will speak about lawmaking in the so-called standard picture that is Greenberg's name for what he takes to be the rival, his main rival picture, a rival theory or picture that surprisingly many of Greenberg's critics own up to. Thirdly, I will canvass why this dilemma between these two theories is in fact a false one, and they're wrong in fact for the very same reason. And I will conclude fourthly with some thoughts on law's authoring end as opposed to its receiving end. So first of all, the moral impact theory of law can, I think, be synthesized, for those of you less familiar with it, with this following proposition. This is Mark Greenberg speaking. Legal obligations are those moral obligations that are the consequence or impact of the actions of legal institutions. So that's his answer, his proposed answer to the question how the content of the law is determined. So make no mistake, he's not speaking about something abstract. He's purporting to address the very same question that occupies lawyers on a daily basis as they figure out what the law is on some matter. And that is his answer, the one you read there. On this answer, all legal obligations and rights and powers and so on are moral obligations and rights and powers and so on, but not vice versa. Yeah? So not all moral obligations, rights are legal, only some of them, which, well, this formula specifies that through the notion of moral impact, or seeks to specify it through the notion of moral impact, which is, however, exceedingly broad. Essentially, what Greenberg means by moral impact is any morally relevant change in the circumstances that is produced by the enactment of the relevant actions of legal institutions. So if you forgive my analogy here, it is morally speaking, indeed legally speaking, not unlike the impact of an asteroid, right? It would certainly trigger a lot of morally relevant changes in terms of what people's moral duties and rights and powers are if an asteroid were to impact right now in Budapest, for example, and not unlike this, says Greenberg, he doesn't use that metaphor. That is my cheeky way of putting it, that he says any morally relevant change in circumstances. So you might think that the notion of the actions of legal institutions serve to properly, or some would narrow down the catch of this formula, but alas, that is not the case. The actions of legal institutions are defined, or rather defined, they are discussed or characterized by Greenberg in terms only of largely unexplained intuitions or suppositions or counterexamples. Basically, Greenberg wants to say, we know what they are, we intuitively know, and we should worry about the moral impact, and that moral impact is the law. Maybe this example, that is Greenberg's example, will help bring out the core message of this moral impact theory. So Greenberg says, in the face of a coordination problem, imagine a statute directing everybody to adopt a particular electricity outlet type, namely, let's call it type A. Imagine at the same time that an influential business or company misunderstands that statute and instead begins to use massively outlets of another type B. And that is in fact the outlet that becomes widely salient instead. Well, if that is so, says Greenberg, then we have a moral obligation to use outlet B. We could probably agree up to this point. But then he adds, and that is also our legal obligation. Yeah, so notice the legislator chose to make type A obligatory, but on Greenberg's theory, it is type B that is legally obligatory, given a particular set of misunderstandings, and in the absence of, for example, a settled canon of legal interpretation that would assign these misunderstandings the legal meaning that he attributes to them. Crucially, note also that on his theory, what makes something an action of a legal institution is not itself a matter of law. Yeah, remember, it's most about pre-theoretically given. Now, it is unclear whether on this theory The law self-regulates. There's law about law. It is unclear, but it certainly does not self-regulate in a way that is focally in the lawmaker's control, right? Indeed, it is even stretched on that account to speak of law as being made, deliberately shaped, as opposed to being triggered, to use David Inuk's also very famous and influential term. Now, what shall we say? What shall we make of this theory? I shall not be the first one to say that it very much fails to track what competent lawyers would deem to be instances of legal obligations, and indeed not deem to be instances of legal obligation. This has been discussed in the literature. I shall not delve into this. And clearly the key notions that Greenberg puts on the table in his formula, like a legal institutions or the legally proper way for a legal institution to act, they are unable to do the necessary discriminating job. This has been said now for a while. But I want to say this, but here's the root cause of all these various mismatches between legal practice and Greenberg's theory. The root cause, which I think is hidden in plain sight, is that there's a neglect of the idea of legal power. Legal powers. Legal power as the ability to intentionally shape legal relationships within limits ultimately determined by law itself, by other legal provisions, in the last analysis, by legal practice, methods of interpretation, accepted techniques of legal reasoning, and so on. Now, legal power is a technique with a long history in Western legal thought, which developed on the back of the notion of legal validity itself, about 2,000 years old. I have written about this elsewhere. And it's probably true to say that in contemporary legal systems, legal power is the primary way in which law is made. Not just legislative sphere or indeed administrative law is full of legal powers, both of general lawmaking, of individual judgments, licenses, whatnot, resolutions, but also in the private domain, the power to marry, the power to issue a will, the power to make a contract. I have no time here to delve into the final bit of this slide that speaks of the root cause, namely Greenberg's denial that legal practice is even able to self-regulate. So I just leave it there. Now, having said that, of course, very briefly about the moral impact theory, one might think, well, isn't that exactly the standard picture that I am working towards? The standard picture, as I foreshadowed, is what, according to Greenberg, is a widespread misconception of law and of the legally correct way to construe it. Indeed, running through Greenberg's work is the suggestion that the moral impact theory is true because the standard picture is false. You see here some echoes of Dworkin's attacks, traditional attacks on so-called positivism. Yeah. And what I think is concerning, the reason why I even discuss it, is that Greenberg's critics broadly own up to the standard picture. I mean, look at leading journals in our subject, jurisprudence, for the last 5-10 years. And it is also the prime target of Greenberg supporters. So what is this standard picture? It is something, again, very, very simple that can be summarized as follows. It is the idea that the way to understand law is in terms of a commander issuing a command and the resulting law matching exactly the commander's intention. No more, no less. The law follows from the command on this account in the same way that communicative meaning follows from a speaker's utterance. Yeah. Hence the association between the standard picture and the model of communication. Now again, what are we to make of the standard picture? Greenberg has had a lot to say, and I think very sound things to say, against this standard picture. And he's of course right when he says the standard picture does not track what competent lawyers deem to be the law, not least because, well, it's a well-known experience that even legislators, never mind other agents who exercise legal power, even legislators may not be fully in control of the legal meaning of their decisions, whether on inception, think of constitutional constraints on legislative power, but also especially perhaps over time, as their choices fall to be construed, say, in light of settled methods of interpretation, changing conventions, adjudicative changes, or other legal provision. It is, of course, all the more so if we speak of private powers, administrative powers, powers of regulation, delegated legislation, and so on. So Greenberg is, of course, right that lawmaking is ill understood on the model of ordinary communication. On that model, there is only one speaker for each utterance, and an utterance's meaning is fixed at the time of speaking. It doesn't keep, it isn't liable to change all the time. So that much is true. But the main point is as follows. It is true because law can only deliberately be made given a framework regime and within its limits. That's why law cannot be understood on the sheer model of ordinary communication. So the very logic of legal power precludes the existence of an unlimited power to make law on anyone's hands, a power unconstrained by the acts and choices of others in the legal system. So indeed, the standard picture, I wish to say, is wrong for the very same reason that the moral impact theory is. And this is why I'm in the third section now of my talk. The following dilemma is, in fact, should be rejected as a false one. Let me synthesize this dilemma. On the one hand, we've got a deflationary account about lawmaking, the moral impact theory. It is deflationary. Why? Because it assigns an unduly scant role to human agency in the making of law. It distorts the basic control that law confers on those exercising legal power. This is a fascinating topic, by the way, which, of course, I can only here scratch the surface of. And on the other hand, we've got an inflationary account of lawmaking, the standard picture. It is inflationary because it assigns an unduly expansive role to individual human agency, that of that one commander. It distorts the fact that legal meaning, the legal meaning of any exercise of legal power, turns on the acts of multiple agents, more or less so, and is liable to change over time. So this dilemma that I've just now canvassed, I say, is false on the one hand. So it's false descriptively as a matter of law. Why? Well, because it distorts legal power as an ability to intentionally make law that is both conferred and limited by the legal order. It makes nonsense of the law's self-regulation in that sense, which is another intriguing idea, by the way. But more importantly, perhaps more pressingly for real-life problems, is the fact that this dilemma is dangerous. It's dangerous because both deflationary and inflationary accounts portray law as something that happens at once, and we can only passively react to, if at all. So on the one hand, the moral impact theory places the focus on the impact, on the consequence of law creating events that somehow have already come about, apparently inexorably. It seems like lawmaking acts are almost on a par with cosmic accidents, legally speaking. We can only figure out what to do now. Whereas on the standard picture, of course, it is true that the lawmaker, this one commander, holds the key to the law's production. But for that very reason, there's apparently not much that any of us, can do about it. On that sort of distorted picture, the law flows down from the authority. I deliberately use this term because it tallies with some pitfalls of a certain interpretation of the work of Joseph Raz, right? In terms of just one authority, a mysterious authority who we don't know. why it acts, and who it is. The law flows down from this commander authority to its subjects, which subjects may perhaps at most ponder the binding force that law has upon them. Yeah? Is it an exclusionary reason, more or less so? But cannot do much more about that, or at least this is silence eclipsed, played down by that theory. So the danger here is that these both two kinds of accounts, which are currently presented as almost the only two options, they systematically eclipse what I call law's authoring end. I think it's ironic that in a rather famous paper now some years ago, Scott Hershowitz, the paper's called The End of Jurisprudence, he summons jurisprudence to worry more about the moral consequences of our legal practices. Hershowitz is sympathetic to Greenberg's enterprise. So jurisprudence should worry more about the moral consequences of our legal practices. Now, I think it is fitting to reply here that, yes, indeed, because consequences matter, we perhaps should worry more about the causes of these consequences and the extent to which these causes are in the control of rational beings capable of deliberation and choice. For these rational beings might as well not have performed the relevant acts or performed them differently. And importantly, law has a crucial role in modulating this. For, of course, law itself can delimit its own decision-making scope, say, by circumscribing jurisdiction, withholding legal power, subjecting it to review, providing more or less discretion through vagueness, through defeasibility, avoidability, etc., etc. So this is the bread and butter of legal practice and policy dispute, but strictly speaking, there's no room for this in both inflationary and deflationary accounts. So let me take one final minute to speak by way of conclusion about, a little bit about what I take to be the outstanding business of general jurisprudence concerning law's authoring end. So what are these neglected questions? Yeah. Well, for one thing, there's business outstanding in pondering the relative suitability of legal power as one way of making law compared to other ways of making law, for example, precedent and custom. For another thing, one may fruitfully discuss the suitability of different kinds of legal power, such as contract or legislation, with very rival rationales that bear very differently some contemporary developments. Thirdly, perhaps, say more about some very intriguing puzzles that arise at the intersection between legal and non-legal powers, yeah? Concerning, for example, the nature of non-justiciable constraints on legal powers, quite a hot topic recently, or even the nature of sovereignty or constituent power, going more on the political theory line. And lastly, and perhaps more importantly, there is a lot of scope there for canvassing techniques, different techniques, for allocating legal power to ensure that they are responsive to the cogent moral reasons that exist why lawmaking needs to be, it isn't just as a matter of fact, but it morally needs to be a multi-person enterprise. Reasons of expertise, proximity to facts of certain institutions, the rule of law, or indeed the self-direction, the autonomous self-direction of individuals and groups, subsidiarity as a requirement of justice, and so on. So I think this business has been outstanding for some time. As I briefly suggested, I think both the moral impact theory and the standard picture radicalize a set of pitfalls that can be found in earlier writings, Dorky and Graz, etc. But in these writings, these pitfalls are much, much, much more qualified. It is, I think, in this very latest iteration that they become so radical that they are also ironically helpful in that they can be better appreciated and detected and diagnosed. So I think it is urgent to take up this business, lest jurisprudence loses its powers. Power both as objects of study, but also in terms of jurisprudence's impact on legal practice and whose real life problems are helpfully the subject matter of this conference. Thank you very much.
We have a little bit over 30 minutes for questions, discussion. If you'll raise your hand, I'll call on you. Is there a microphone for people asking questions? So wait for the microphone to be brought to you so that everybody can hear you. So the floor is open. Paul.
So I have a question. It's particularly for Sean, but possibly for Laura as well. And how would you apply your remarks to social media, where maybe billions of people are getting morally influenced, millions are vying to be the influencers? So it's a space where people are being influenced, but you could also argue that it's an inherently corrupting space. Can you really educate people to moral virtue on Twitter, for example? I'm thinking of Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. So if you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you for that, Paul. I would share your reservations actually about social media, thinking particularly about Twitter, which is now monetized, and it's a platform for people to hate other people, and I think there's a lot of polemical remarks that get put on Twitter, and these days there isn't the filter that there used to be to take down offensive tweets. So I think, social media, it does have the potential to spread positive human traits like love and friendship, but in my experience it's doing that less and less, and it's more the case that again, certainly with Twitter or X, we're getting very polemical. People go on there specifically to lose their temper with other people. And it's increasingly a platform for extremism and far-right ideologies. Now, other kinds of social media, I think that's less the case. I think there's still there are still outlets for people to argue with one another respectfully. But I mean, at the moment, I'm leading an initiative or a working group at Birmingham, looking at weaning us off Twitter because of these negative characteristics. And it's difficult because all universities have a Twitter presence, and if you withdraw from it altogether, then you lose your voice to a very significant extent. You lose the power to reach people with the positive message that you're putting out. But my issue with it is that you are, by continuing to use Twitter, you are engaged in an activity which is certainly contrary to the values of my university, I think. And so it's increasingly a pragmatic decision to stay with Twitter. And I'm very troubled by it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add to that, with Iris Murdoch's philosophy, there's a strong emphasis on attention, the concept of attention. And I think that has a lot of application to social media, and sort of particularly as linking it to what I was saying about Plato and Aristotle, they talk a lot about the educative function of the arts in the young or in a developing mind. And I think there's a lot of evidence that smartphones are, can be quite damaging on the development of children's minds and pursuits, depending on how they're used. But Murdoch talks a lot about seeing the real. She talks a lot about how we end up living in our own kind of fantasy worlds. And I think social media has the potential to enable people's sort of bubbles and fantasy worlds to continue rather than enabling them to see the real. So I would probably add, she has some really interesting insights that can kind of just, it's not that, as you say, it's not that social media is bad in itself. It can be educative. It probably can provide opportunities for unselfing, but it just needs to be properly used and regulated and managed rather than monetized, as you said.
Veronica.
Yes, thank you to the three of you. And one question for Marie, another for Laura. Marie, so I think that your diagnosis is correct, and the dilemma between inflation and deflation seems very artificial. But one thing that has struck me is the focus on passivity, right? That there is no anymore, or passivity. Yes, so in the moral impact theory, there is just something, things happen to us. There's no, the legislator, the legal practitioner has no power. And in the other picture, in the standard picture, we know is actually the speaker's ability that determines what is the convention and therefore what is the meaning of the text. But I think things got worse with the Greenberg theory because there is only a focus. They claim is a metaphysics. There's an ontology here. So there's nothing the subject can do. And it's because, of course, at the heart is practical reason, and none of them understand what is the character of it. So what I miss from you is a bit more of a positive elaboration. Why this passivity? And what they misunderstood or they overlook, because it's either the focus is on just conventions or now a really thick ontology where there is no subject at all, there is no agent. And thank you very much, Laura. I love Iris Murdoch, but I think there is a tension here, and you talk very cleverly. You avoid the word law and you talk about policies, right? But the law has a coercive power. And I think one feature on, for example, the idea of perfection in Murdoch, and one example of the mother-in-law, when you see that reason moves and she changes because she's able to pay attention to features of her daughter-in-law that she didn't realize, and how she can have a change of her moral vision, is all an inner process. Of course, pain, it's transparent, is outward looking, is looking at features of the world, but it's all done by reason. And I wonder how there's a tension with thinking that can law do this, and if it's policy, then there is no coercion, right? There can be a coercive aspect, because that will do violence to the picture that she wants to put forward, Iris Murdoch, and the Platonic vision as well. Mm-hmm.
Let's hear from Morris first, and then Laura.
Thank you for that very interesting question. Very briefly, 3 points. One, concerning passivity. I do not wish to suggest that discussing law from the receiving end, as it were, doesn't raise important questions that are worth addressing and that are, in every sense. So there's a lot of very important concerns about interpreting law, right? I was speaking about passivity with respect to lawmaking, right? Second point, you rightly note that Mark Greenberg's account comes with several ontological, as it were, which time-precluded discussion here. There are at least 2 kinds of ontology, I would say, in his relevant work. One of them, I would say, is a negative sense. So I briefly mentioned that. He thinks because legal practice cannot self-regulate, and to argue this, he builds on a so-called, a similar philosophical puzzle than the one that is sometimes called the Christenstein puzzle. I think wrongly so. So because legal practice cannot determine full relevance, it must be something else, and hence we think it's morality. And the positive ontology that comes with it, and that is my third point, is extremely thin. I mean, he takes for granted that there are some moral truths, but he doesn't explain much about their ontology. Indeed, he doesn't even say much about the crucial notion of well-being. But definitely these things are very much worth a further study.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And I agree with you, there is a tension there between the sort of legislative policy side of the paper and then just exploring Murdoch's moral philosophy. The legislative policy element is very clear in Plato and Aristotle, that they think that there is a role for the legislator in promoting the arts. Most people find that to be very draconian, very prescriptive, coercive, as you say. So I was sort of taking a bit of a step back. I still think it's an important conceptual issue. It might be more, as you say, policy rather than legislation. It might be about providing the kind of background conditions for human flourishing through art. And so really I was sort of putting the ideas out there. I'd be prepared to accept that those are slightly separate questions, the legislative question and the policy question, and then what Murdoch is teaching us about practical reason. But I suppose maybe there is a tension in natural law between, on the one hand, the basic human goods and how we define those, and then the step of what the law ought to look like in light of that. And perhaps those two things are held in tension with one another. But thank you for raising the question, and I think it's a really helpful clarification. Thank you.
Connor.
So these remarks are for Laura. I really loved the paper, and insofar as the prescriptive takeaway is that lawmakers ought to take art and the pedagogical function of art very seriously, as the classical scholars did. I totally agree. I'm trying to work through in my head some practical problems. I'm just thinking of the UK, maybe as just an example, because we might have a problem with promoting and uplifting art and exposing young people to art if artists as a sort of cohort lack or have a very shaky grasp on intellectual grasp of goodness, of beauty and truth. If they see art fundamentally as a sort of emotivist mode of self-expression rather than anything transcendental. So one solution, Aristotle might say, well, the state should foster the truly good and the beautiful and sift the wheat from the chaff. Then the problem is politicians don't have a grasp of what is good and true and beautiful. Often they often defer to what they think the experts think is good art or what have you. So I wonder, is our crisis about how to think about art in contemporary society linked to a broader crisis of or political authorities not having a sort of solid form of practical rationality, not knowing what to make of ideas of truth and goodness and beauty. So if we don't sort that muddle, we might not be able to sort how we think about art and how it fits into our collective life together.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, really helpful and connects as well to some of Sean's comments, again, about where do we go to find examples, exemplars for good practical reasoning and goodness, truth, beauty. Murdoch's moral philosophy, she often gets criticised for being very clear about high art and great art, and that most art is precisely expressivist and sort of not going to get you towards the good. But what's quite interesting is because she uses the term beauty to connect with art and also the natural world and also God. When she talks about the natural world, it seems much more accessible, the kinds of examples she gives. Like she says, oh, I'm worrying about something, and then I looked up and there was this kestrel, and I was taken out of myself. And it's the same sort of mechanism is going on of attending to beauty, but it's kind of natural beauty rather than artistic beauty. So there could be some scope there to think about more accessible forms of beauty that are not kind of mediated through human beings. But I do think it's going to be that's going to be one of the sort of practical challenges I face as I develop this project. So what you've said is really helpful as I think about that more. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan Tomáštík from Comenius University in Slovakia. Perhaps I have another angle that concerns this matter of art and policy and legislation. And I was thinking that in your presentation, both the first part and the second part, you stressed what I think can be called an instrumental value of art. So it contributes to unselfing, it promotes good moral sensitivity, moral imagination. And so there is this question of what should the legislator do about this, and whether a law or policy should be utilized in order to promote art with the view of improving people's characters and people's moral sensitivity. Now, I'm wondering if it is the case that aesthetic experience is also a basic good, so a good in itself, should we also be worried about instrumentalization of the basic good, and whether it can distort people's understanding of art being a good in itself, or whether, on the other hand, it is completely okay for the state to focus on those positive externalities and not be so focused on, edifying people about the very point, the very good in itself, which is art. So I suppose that's also a broader question, also for Sean, I suppose. But I really appreciate your presentation, and perhaps this also relates to the tension in the natural law and the law and the role of lawmaker in promoting basic goods, but also their instrumental value for the sake of other goods.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really helpful observation. I think with aesthetic experience and then trying to instrumentalize aesthetic experience, that's a tricky one, because the whole point of aesthetic experience is you value something purely non-instrumentally for its own sake. The aesthetic experience is really supposed to have that kind of structure of it doesn't take you anywhere else apart from what you're contemplating. It's that contemplative activity. And so I suppose it's not so much instrumentalizing it as making possible the conditions for experiencing it, which I think is a little bit different conceptually. But I will think about that more, because it was a really helpful question.
Yes, thank you also for the question. I think that the state obviously has a role in supporting the arts. In the UK context, that's very difficult at the moment because there isn't the money to go around, and politicians, being very pragmatic creatures, want to spend it on other things. And so I think there is a duty on the state to provide funding, but I think increasingly it's up to art organisations themselves to reach out to people who wouldn't typically come to the ballet or the opera, and for those organisations to reach out through reasonable ticket prices and advertising, but to try and reach as wide an audience as possible, because opera and ballet and sacred music is for everybody. It's not just for the select few, but I think that the reality is that most of the time it is the select few who will typically attend the ballet or the opera. And so I think, I guess what I'm saying is I think it's a communal effort, not just an effort of the state, to foster the arts.
Yeah, and sorry, just a kind of footnote to that is I was thinking about the way Plato and Aristotle again talk a lot about the developing mind of a child and education, and there's been a lack in the UK anyway of just having children learning musical instruments, and that's a kind of praxis form of unselfing. Murdoch talks about like learning a language, and that's a way to unself, but learning an instrument, again, it's just like this practical skill you learn through which you can be kind of taken out of yourself, and then to just to have opportunities for that in schools, which a lot of children don't, would be a very good move in the right direction.
Eric.
I think this is a question for Sean and for Laura. I'm interested in both of the projects, and I'm largely sympathetic. I think both have to acknowledge one major difference between the way Aristotle and Plato were thinking about politics and the way moderns do. And I'm thinking in particular of the fact that the common good that you're talking about when you're talking about a Greek city-state with maybe 10,000 active citizens is very different from the common good in a nation with 10 million people. The city of 10,000 has people who all speak the same language, a very close history, and a shared set of religious beliefs that are organized around one dominant god and family gods. And in modernity, you have religions that transcend nations. You have deep differences about orthodoxy among different sects in that religion. Among people who aren't so religious, you have differences about ideology. And so if you're talking about art and on one side and law and coercion on the other, you need, in a city-state, art can ennoble toward a common good that's very thick because you have the shared history and shared traditions. But art in the modern context, like in the way you two are talking about, I think it can help people be decent, self-reliant, appreciate good in their own lives. But I'm not sure that art can ennoble towards some very thick notion of the common good. And so the question that guys to both do is, what does art ennoble towards in the modern context, and what must art give up trying to do the way like Sophocles and Aeschylus were trying to do in their plays?
So thank you for the question, which is very, very thought-provoking. I think you're absolutely right that what applies to this relatively small city-state doesn't necessarily scale up to the modern community. And you're right, so there are certain aspects of community that are transcendent of political communities. And I guess what fired in my mind when you said that was actually St. Augustine, where you have the earthly city, which is the place where we live and work and act and think and dream and so forth. And then the city of God, which is, kind of an intellectual community, really. It's a community of like-minded people. Ultimately, it's the heavenly Jerusalem, but on earth, on pilgrimage, it is a group of people who share some values with the other people around them, but also share different values from them and transcend that political community. And the other thing that it triggered in my mind was the very difficult transition that was made in and around the 17th century, where religious groups were held with suspicion and were even illegal in some circumstances. And that very painful transition took more than a century to resolve itself into anything like what we have now, which is a kind of toleration of various different groups. So that's probably not massively helpful. That's the thoughts that came to me, and I'll think more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that question. And one reason I'm interested in Iris Murdoch's moral philosophy is because I think she retains some of the conceptual insights of the classical tradition whilst not holding on to such a thick conception of the good as you might find, particularly in Plato, who she looks up to, but she wants to have a much thinner notion of the good. And I think her moral philosophy can sort of soften some of those assumptions that we might not share now, whilst retaining some of the same concepts and ideas and allowing us to look back to the classical tradition and then revisit it in light of our more modern assumptions. So I suppose what I want to develop in the paper is perhaps a conversation between those two traditions and to show how Murdoch's conception of the good is much better able to respond to that problem than, say, the Platonic one. So.
I wonder, I'm going to take the chair's privilege and just to ask a little question about Murdoch and the ennobling qualities of art, which I'm a little skeptical of. It seems like there's room for a distinction between pursuing the good and pursuing the good reasonably. There are plenty of people who have a high level of sensitivity to aesthetic value and are not very good people. This is also replicated on the part of many artists who don't necessarily have a good idea of how to integrate the pursuit of the good that they are involved in into an overall picture of what a good life would look like. And so it doesn't seem to me that it follows as part of what it is, of what's involved simply in pursuing that good, that it's going to have ennobling qualities. It's going to be part of a flourishing life. It's important for a flourishing life. I agree with all of that. I'll talk about that tomorrow as well. But it doesn't seem to me that it follows that there's something necessarily or essentially ennobling about that particular pursuit, except insofar as it's integrated into an overall reasonable form of life.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. I think that's quite consistent with what she says. So I've had to give quite a broad outline of her view, but I think that's why she's quite nervous about she talks about the difference between the kind of art that does enable unselfing and then all the art that fails. And so I think she would agree with that. She would share that worry. I think that's why she also has other objects of unselfing in her writings. She talks about the natural world. She talks about God. Her ultimate goal, I suppose, is the good. And she's just trying to find these kind of proxy objects for good that can help human beings. But I think she's very aware, and I think that comes out a lot in her novels as well, of the sort of complexity of human moral experience and how this is a very difficult thing. So it's not that the arts can automatically have that effect, it's just that there is an important role there for aesthetic experience, play, in enabling human flourishing. So I think she would probably share that worry, and I think her account's broad enough to respond. And perhaps when I present a longer version, I can kind of soften that so that it becomes a bit clearer. So that I really do want to. I'm less sceptical about that point, but I also think there's room within her moral philosophy to kind of be more nuanced in the way she responds. But thank you.
Time for one more question, if anybody has one.
I've got a follow-up to that question.
Oh, yeah, then please.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, just to build on that last question. I mean, it was famous that the Nazi high command were enmeshed in fine art, in opera, and paintings, and art. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, people in the West were anxious about the fact that that was the case and they could still perpetrate such savagery and violence, and it was held to have shattered the consensus that previously existed, that education in the fine arts brought about a good personality, a good person. And I just wondered to what extent you'd agree or disagree with that consensus.
Yes, I think that's something I really want to think more about, the kind of aesthetic and moral value and how they do indeed separate out. So I think that's something I will have to think about more in the paper. I'm hoping that Murdoch's kind of slightly broader take on the classical inheritance and a more pluralistic take and a more kind of humble take can help answer that question and give voice to some of those worries.
We are going to take a 15-minute break. We'll be back here at 11, and let's thank our speakers for an excellent panel.